Hello, young wizard. This is the story of the darkest name our world has ever known. A name that grown witches and wizards fear to whisper even now. But before the name there was only a boy. A boy born into pain and left unwanted. A boy who carried inside him a hunger that grew and twisted until it became something terrible. And it began in a small, broken cottage where the last heirs of an ancient family clung to the memory of their greatness while the walls around them crumbled. That family was the Gaunts, once proud descendants of Salazar Slytherin. But by the time of Merope Gaunt, the mother of Voldemort, the bloodline had withered into poverty and cruelty, their shack falling apart, their lives poisoned by anger, the last tokens of their history a ring and a locket, handled with more love than they ever showed each other. And Merope grew up beneath the cruelty of her father Marvolo and her brother Morfin, both loud with their pride of pure blood, and both quick to strike when she faltered, calling her weak, worthless, unworthy of the name they carried. Merope spent her days in silence, beaten down and hopeless, until her eyes fell on a man who seemed to be everything her life was not. Tom Riddle, a handsome, wealthy muggle who rode past their shack on his horse, tall and sure of himself, proud in ways her family could never match. And though he was everything her father despised, he became everything she thought might save her. She fell into obsession, clinging to the dream of leaving her broken home behind. She used the one tool she had, a love potion, slipping it to Tom Riddle Sr. until he looked at her with false devotion. And in that haze, he married her and carried her away from the shack into rooms with clean walls and bright lamps. And for a time she believed she had escaped, that the cruelty of her family had ended. But she grew reckless. She hoped that the lie could turn into truth if she stopped the potion. And when she did, Tom's eyes cleared, the anger returned, and his pride would not forgive. He walked away from her and never looked back. Alone and pregnant, Merope wandered the streets of London with her strength fading, selling the last heirlooms of her family for coins, the locket and the ring that had once meant everything to her father, now gone to strangers. And she stumbled into a gray orphanage, weak and trembling. And on a winter night in 1926, she gave birth to her son, named him Tom, after the man who abandoned her, and Marvolo, after the father who despised her. And then she died, leaving the child with nothing but his name. Tom Marlowe Riddle grew up in the orphanage with its iron beds and thin blankets, its rattling windows and stew that stretched thin across too many bowls, a place where children fought for scraps of comfort. But Tom stood apart, a boy who rarely cried, who watched with sharp eyes that seemed too old for his face, unsettling the nurses who whispered that something about him was wrong. And by the time he could walk, he was already feared. Strange things happened around him, things that made the other children whisper. A boy who bullied him ended up dangling upside down from a beam, screaming while Tom stood calm and smiling below. A girl's rabbit was found dead in its hutch, eyes wide and unblinking, and Tom only shrugged when she cried. On a summer trip, 2 children followed him into the caves by the sea and came back pale and silent, refusing to speak of what they had seen. And he collected tokens from these moments, little trophies hidden in a box beneath a loose floorboard, proof of his control, proof that he was different. The matron scolded him and wrote notes in her ledger, but when she confronted him, he spoke politely, with calm eyes and smooth words that made her doubt her own memory. Adults thought him well-mannered, while the children kept their distance, telling each other stories that he could talk to snakes or make you obey with a stare. And he learned early that fear gave him space, and in that space he thrived. By the age of 10, he carried himself like a prince among beggars, tall and proud even in second-hand clothes, already dreaming of power, whispering to himself at night that he was meant for more than dusty halls and cracked shoes. not yet knowing the word wizard, not yet knowing Hogwarts, only knowing that what stirred inside him set him apart and marked him for greatness. The matron finally wrote a note that read, "Disturbances beyond discipline, outside help needed." Though she had no idea who could help a boy like Tom, and she did not yet know that someone was already on their way, someone who would walk through the grey gates of the orphanage on a spring afternoon and name what Tom truly was. Tom sat on his cot with his box hidden beneath the floor and a book open in his lap when he heard the steps in the hall. He closed the book and smoothed the blanket, lifting his chin as the knock came at the door. And when it opened, a tall man stepped inside, wearing a long coat, half-moon spectacles, eyes that seemed kind and piercing all at once. And for the first time, Tom Riddle was about to hear the truth of what he was, words that would change everything that followed. The man who stepped through the door was Albus Dumbledore, not yet the great headmaster he would one day become, but already a wizard with a sharp mind and a careful heart. And he had come to see the strange boy the matron had written about, a boy whose name sat heavy on the orphanage ledger, Tom Marvolo Riddle. Dumbledore spoke with the matron first, hearing her stories about missing trinkets and frightened children, and she told him how Tom could make things happen, how he seemed to enjoy it when others were afraid, and how she no longer knew what to do with him. And Dumbledore listened without judgment, his eyes thoughtful, and then he asked to see the boy himself. Tom sat straight on his cot, the blanket smooth under his hands, his dark eyes fixed on the man as he entered. And when Dumbledore introduced himself, Tom tilted his head, curious but wary, already studying the visitor with the sharpness of someone who wanted to measure advantage. And Dumbledore told him plainly that he was not ordinary, that he was a wizard, and that there was a place for him at a school called Hogwarts. The word struck Tom like a key in a lock, because for years he had known he was different. He had felt it in his bones, in the way animals cowered, in the way children obeyed, in the way things moved when he willed them to. And now here was proof that he was not mad or cursed, but chosen, and he felt something swell inside him. Not gratitude, but pride. Still, Dumbledore was careful. He watched Tom closely and asked to see the small box he kept hidden, the trophies of coins and trinkets taken from others. And when Tom hesitated, Dumbledore's voice grew firm, and the boy obeyed, though his eyes flashed with anger at being caught, and the professor returned the objects to their owners, teaching Tom that magic should not be used for cruelty, though Tom heard only the lesson that his secrets could be discovered. When the letter of acceptance was placed in his hands, Tom held it like a weapon, his fingers tight around the parchment, and he asked questions not about lessons or teachers, but about power, about whether other wizards could do what he could do, about whether he was the most special of them all. And Dumbledore answered with patience, saying that Hogwarts would give him guidance, but greatness would depend on choices. The summer passed with Tom restless in the orphanage, waiting for the day he could leave. And when it came, he was led through the wizarding world for the first time, the cobbled streets of Diagon Alley opening before his eyes, shops bursting with color and movement, owls hooting from cages, wands stacked like bundles of light, cauldrons gleaming in the sun. And yet he did not gasp like other children. He walked through with calm interest, storing away every sight like ammunition. At Ollivander's he was measured for a wand, and when the yew and phoenix feather wand was placed in his hand, a spark of fire seemed to run through the room, and the old wand maker's eyes widened, for he had seen the twin of that wand before. And though he said little, Tom caught the weight in his voice, and he felt destiny settle deeper upon him. September came, and Tom boarded the train that would take him to Hogwarts, a boy among dozens, though he already stood apart, his posture stiff, his gaze cool, and when the sorting hat was placed on his head, it barely hesitated before sending him to Slytherin, where ambition was praised and cunning was celebrated. And Tom smiled for the first time in weeks, because he knew he had found the place where he could begin his climb. Hogwarts opened like a treasure chest before him, stone halls echoing with footsteps, staircases that moved at will, a ceiling enchanted to mirror the sky, tables groaning under endless food, and classes that spoke of charms and potions, of transfiguration and history, of spells that bent the world to the will of the caster. And Tom absorbed it all with a hunger that never slowed, always watching, always learning, and always careful to show only what he wished others to see. Professors praised his intelligence. Classmates admired his looks and manners. But beneath the surface he was already drawing lines, sorting those who might be useful from those who were beneath him, making friends not out of kindness, but strategy. And by the end of his first year he was already more than a student. He was a leader in the making, quiet but commanding, with a gaze that made others lower their eyes. Hogwarts had given him a new world, but Tom wanted more than lessons and applause. He wanted to find its secrets, the whispers of hidden rooms, the legends of chambers sealed by founders, the magic that would let him rise beyond the limits of any boy. And deep in the stone of the castle, waiting in silence, there was a secret that seemed made for him. Tom Riddle grew at Hogwarts in a way he never had in the orphanage. Here he was no longer the strange child among muggles, but a boy marked by talent and charm. He excelled in every class. He spoke with confidence that made professors lean in. He walked the halls as if he already belonged to the castle itself. The other students admired him, but they also feared him. They could sense there was something colder beneath the polished smile, and Tom learned quickly how to use that fear without ever letting it show on his face. He became a favorite of Professor Slughorn, who gathered bright students into his little circle, offering them sweets and connections, and Tom shone among them, always polite, always eager to learn, asking careful questions about magic that touched the edges of things darker than most dared to consider. And Slughorn, pleased by his cleverness, answered more than he should have, and Tom stored every word like a knife for the future. But Tom's hunger was never satisfied with lessons alone. He wanted to know the secrets that lay in the stone. He wanted to uncover the legends of Slytherin himself. And from his first year, he had listened to whispers of the Chamber of Secrets, a place said to be hidden deep beneath the school, created by the founder who had distrusted Muggle-borns, a chamber that was said to hold a monster, and Tom could not let the thought go. He searched the library for clues. He traced the edges of walls with his fingers. He walked at night when the castle was asleep, and in time he found it, the entrance that opened only for him, because he alone carried the tongue of serpents in his mouth, the gift of Slytherin's line. And when the stone slid aside and the darkness yawned below, Tom stepped into it as if it had always been waiting. The basilisk stirred in the shadows, great and ancient, its eyes deadly, its hiss a language only he understood. And Tom felt a thrill run through him, because here was proof that he was chosen, that his blood gave him power no other student could dream of. He did not think of the danger. He thought of the control, and he loosed it upon the castle. Children whispered of a monster in the halls, of footsteps when no one was there. And then the attacks began. Muggle-born students struck down, stiff as stone, fear spreading like fire through the common rooms, teachers patrolling with drawn wands, and Tom watched it all with calm interest, because he was the storm hidden inside the cloud. He was careful though, clever enough to know he could not be caught. He framed another, a boy who loved strange creatures and kept a spider for a pet, a boy named Hagrid, big-hearted and clumsy, easy to blame when fear was high, and when the school looked for someone to punish. Tom guided their eyes to him, and Hagrid was cast out, carrying the weight of a crime he had never committed. Tom returned to his place as a model student, praised for his brilliance, admired for his manners, and no one looked at him twice as The attacks faded and the chamber closed once more, the monster slumbering in the dark until he chose to call it again, and he smiled to himself because he had proven what he already believed, that the world could be bent to his will, that even a castle as old as Hogwarts could bow before him if he was clever enough. Still, Tom wanted more. More than fear, more than hidden chambers. He wanted to defeat the one enemy that stood against every wizard, the one truth no spell had ever undone. He wanted to conquer death itself, and even as a teenager, he began to ask questions in hushed voices, questions about tearing the soul, about binding it to objects, about how one might live forever. Professors told him such things were forbidden, but Tom only smiled, because he knew that what was forbidden was usually what mattered most. And while the rest of the school celebrated the end of the danger, Tom sat alone with his books and his thoughts, already planning the next step in a path that would take him further than any boy had ever gone. As Tom grew older at Hogwarts, his mask grew sharper too. By the time he was a prefect, he carried himself with such poise that teachers spoke of him as if he were already destined for greatness. His marks were perfect, his speeches smooth, and he had gathered a small circle of students who followed his lead without needing to be told why. They felt his power and they wanted to be near it. And though he smiled at them and offered quiet encouragement, he thought of them as tools, nothing more than steps on a staircase. He was already climbing. He spent long hours in the library hunting through shelves that most students never touched, digging through histories and forbidden lore, looking for anything that spoke of life beyond death. And he began to hear whispers of dark magic so foul that few even wrote about it, magic that split the soul and bound it to the earth. And though the very idea made others recoil, for Tom it was irresistible, because he had feared death since the day he understood his mother had died before she could even hold him. And that fear had turned into hatred of the idea that anyone could be weak enough to fall. Slughorn saw only the bright student, the boy who asked clever questions. And one evening, when Tom pressed him with just the right mix of charm and curiosity, Slughorn spoke the word Horcrux, fumbling through an explanation of what it was, a way to anchor the soul. And though he grew uneasy the more he spoke, Tom's eyes shone with hunger, not horror, and he left that conversation with his path set more firmly than ever before. He would not die. He would tear himself apart if it meant staying alive. By his 6th and 7th years, he had become a figure of legend in the castle, admired by professors, whispered about in the common rooms. And yet behind closed doors, he was already experimenting with magic too dark for any classroom. He murdered to test his theories. He used relics tied to the founders to house pieces of himself, and though no one saw the acts, his very face began to change, growing sharper, colder, less human with every step. When he graduated, he did not vanish into obscurity like so many others. He pursued influence with precision, taking work first at Borgin and Burke's, where he charmed wealthy collectors and learned the trade of dark artifacts. And there he found more relics, more objects worthy of his fragments. And when he killed Hepzibah Smith, a wealthy witch who owned treasures of Helga Hufflepuff and Salazar Slytherin, he left her house as if nothing had happened, and the items disappeared into his keeping, anchors for the soul he was determined to scatter across the world. Years passed, and his name began to spread beyond the school. No longer Tom Riddle, but Lord Voldemort, a title he crafted from the letters of his birth, a new self he believed was greater, immortal, untainted by the weakness of his father or the shame of his mother. And his followers grew in number, drawn by fear or promises of power, men and women who branded themselves with the mark he created, the skull and serpent that burned their skin and tied them to his call. But even as his legend grew, he could not let go of the place that had first shown him who he was. He returned to Hogwarts under the pretense of seeking a post as defense against the dark arts professor. and Dumbledore, now the one in charge, met him in the office, looked into the eyes of the man the boy had become, and refused him, not with anger, but with clarity, saying that Hogwarts would never serve as a base for his ambitions. And in that moment Voldemort's charm cracked, because he had thought himself irresistible, and instead he left with hatred burning hotter than ever, vowing that if the school would not belong to him through respect, it would one day bow through fear. The rejection hardened him, driving him deeper into the shadows, and his soul, already torn by murder, stretched thinner, his appearance becoming more twisted with each Horcrux he created, and those who once admired the handsome prefect would not have recognized what he was becoming, but to his followers he was only greater, a figure who seemed to command death itself, and they gave themselves to him willingly, believing his cause was their salvation. He had cast off the name Tom Riddle, cast off the orphanage, cast off every tie that bound him to weakness, and now he stood as something new, something the world had never seen before. But the world would soon learn his name and tremble at it. The years that followed were the years when Voldemort began to shape the wizarding world into his battlefield. His name was spoken in whispers at first, and then not at all. Families vanished overnight. Screams echoed in the dark, and no one dared open their doors, and he gathered more and more followers, men and women who called themselves Death Eaters, who bore his mark and carried his orders into every corner of Britain, spreading fear with every step, because fear was the weapon he valued most. The Ministry was slow to act, unwilling to believe how deeply his influence reached, but those who lived through it knew the truth, that Voldemort's shadow touched every family, that his spies sat in positions of power, and that resistance often meant death. And yet some still fought, the Order of the Phoenix rising under Dumbledore's guidance, striking back in secret, protecting those they could, but they were few against the many, and every victory was bought with sacrifice. Voldemort himself became less a man and more a figure of terror, appearing when least expected, killing without hesitation, his wand raised in effortless strikes. And though he had already split his soul into Horcruxes, he continued his search for more relics, more ways to anchor himself, because he feared even the faintest trace of mortality. He feared the grave more than any curse. It was during this rise that a prophecy was spoken. Sybil Trelawney, in a shuddering voice, foretelling that a child born at the end of July would be marked as his equal, that this child had the power to defeat him. And though the prophecy was overheard only in part by Severus Snape, it was enough. Voldemort could not allow such a child to live, and he began his hunt, narrowing his gaze on two families, the Longbottoms and the Potters. Convinced that Harry Potter was the true threat, he set his path toward Godric's Hollow, a quiet village where James and Lily Potter hid under the Fidelius charm. But betrayal opened the door. Peter Pettigrew, once their friend, gave up their secret, and so on. That Halloween night, Voldemort entered the home, striking James down in the hall, advancing on Lily as she stood before her son's crib. And though he offered her a chance to step aside, she refused, and her refusal bound her child with a protection Voldemort could not understand. He lifted his wand, spoke the curse he had spoken so many times before, Avada Kedavra, and the green light filled the room. But this time the curse rebounded, his body collapsing, his spirit ripped from it, shattered and clinging, while the boy lived, marked only by a lightning scar upon his forehead. In that moment, Voldemort fell, his reign of terror broken, his followers scattered in panic, many captured, some claiming they had been under the Imperious curse, some vanishing into hiding, and the wizarding world erupted in relief, crying out that the Dark Lord was gone, defeated by a baby, and they called Harry Potter the boy who lived, celebrating without knowing how fragile their victory truly was. Because Voldemort was not dead, he could not die. not while his soul was anchored in the Horcruxes he had created. He lingered as a broken shadow, bodiless, stripped of strength, and yet still clinging to existence, his will burning like a coal under ash, waiting for the chance to rise again. The war had ended, but the story of Voldemort had not. It had only shifted into a darker silence, one that would last for years, one that gave the world a false sense of safety, even as the shadow waited to return. When the cursed Godric's Hollow tore his body apart, Voldemort became less than a ghost. His soul stretched thin, clinging to the fragments he had bound into objects, and he drifted through the world in a form that could not be seen by most eyes, a shadow that carried no flesh, a will without substance, too weak to strike and too proud to admit defeat. So he fled across the sea to the forests of Albania, where he hid among ruins and creatures that cared little for the shape of man or monster, and there he lingered for years, feeding on snakes, whispering to the dark, plotting his return, while the wizarding world told itself he was gone. But the hunger for life never left him. He hated the shape he had become, hated the weakness, and he waited for the day when some fool might stumble into his grasp. And that day came in the form of a timid man named Quirinus, a professor from Hogwarts who had gone wandering the world in search of knowledge, soft-spoken and nervous, unprepared for what he found in those woods. And when Voldemort revealed himself, Quirrell bent like dry straw in the wind. He became the vessel that the Dark Lord needed, weak but useful, and together they set their eyes on a way to return to true strength. The target was the Sorcerer's Stone, guarded inside Hogwarts itself, a stone that promised eternal life and endless wealth. And with Quirrell as his shell, Voldemort crept back into the castle he had once dreamed of ruling, hiding in plain sight, smiling behind a turban, whispering into the ear of a man too afraid to resist. And though the staff did not see the truth, the presence of the Dark Lord stirred the old stones awake. The castle seemed colder, shadows stretched longer, as if the very walls remembered his touch. Quirrell moved under his command, setting traps, hunting unicorns in the Forbidden Forest to drink their blood, silver running down his lips, a half-life bought at a terrible price. And all the while Voldemort's voice urged him on, promising glory, demanding obedience, driving him closer and closer to the stone, until at last he came face to face with a boy who should have been no more than a child in his first year of lessons. Harry Potter stood against him, and when Quirrell tried to seize the stone, the protection Lily had given her son burned him, his flesh blistering at the touch, and Voldemort, desperate and furious, abandoned the ruined body, a scream echoing through the chambers as he fled once more into the dark, weaker than before, but still not gone, never gone, because his soul was chained to the earth by the anchors he had made. The wizarding world barely understood what had happened. The staff at Hogwarts spoke of a possessed teacher, a danger averted, and they praised Harry for his courage. But only Dumbledore understood the deeper truth, that Voldemort had reached once again toward life, that he had not been destroyed, only delayed, and that the fight that had begun with the fall of the Potters was far from over. In the forests of Albania, Voldemort lingered once more, bitter, bodiless, clinging. But the lesson was clear. He needed not just servants, he needed loyal ones, stronger ones, ones who would not break at the first sign of fear. And so he began again to watch, to wait, to plan the next move that would carry him closer to rebirth. While Voldemort lingered in the shadows of Albania, his influence had already found a way back into Hogwarts through a relic he had created years before, a simple black diary that to most eyes was only ink and paper. But inside it lay a fragment of his soul, bound and waiting, a Horcrux, crafted when he was still a student, and like all his Horcruxes, it was made with murder and sealed with the darkest intent. designed not only to hold him in this world, but to preserve the memory of the boy he had once been, clever, charming, and merciless. The diary passed from hand to hand until it came into the possession of a girl named Ginny Weasley, the youngest of 7 children, shy and eager to prove herself. And when she opened its pages, she found that the ink would answer her, words forming to comfort her, to listen to her secrets, and she poured her heart into it, never knowing that with every confession she was giving more of herself away, feeding the shade of Tom Riddle that grew stronger with each stroke of her quill. The fragment inside the diary whispered to her, flattered her, comforted her, and then it began to guide her, urging her to do things she did not understand, to write messages on walls in her own hand that she would not remember, to open doors she thought she had only dreamed of. And soon the Chamber of Secrets was opened again, the monster within set loose on the school, Muggle-born children once more falling victim to its gaze, their bodies stiff as stone in the corridors, while panic spread. The teachers searched for answers, the students whispered of the heir of Slytherin, and the castle fell into fear, the way it had decades earlier, when Tom himself had first opened the chamber. And through it all, Ginny grew weaker, her face pale, her voice trembling, because the diary was draining her, pulling her life away to fuel the boy who was becoming more real each day, a memory taking flesh, a ghost of Tom Riddle at 16, walking the halls again through. Harry Potter stumbled into the heart of this mystery with Ron and Hermione at his side, piecing together the clues until he found himself deep beneath the castle in the chamber itself, facing not only the basilisk, but the memory of Tom Riddle, handsome and cold, who spoke with the arrogance of someone who believed he had already won. And he explained how he had fed on Ginny's secrets, how he had twisted her into his puppet, and how he would return in full through her sacrifice. But Harry carried with him not only courage, but the loyalty of those who had come before him. And when Fawkes the Phoenix brought him the sorting hat with the sword of Gryffindor hidden inside, he struck down the basilisk, its fangs piercing the air with poison, and then, with one of those fangs in his hand, he drove it through the diary, ink pouring out like blood, the pages screaming as the fragment of soul was destroyed, the memory of Tom Riddle screaming and vanishing with it. Ginny awoke weak but alive, the shade of the Dark Lord banished once more, and the chamber sealed again. And though the world above rejoiced that the attacks had ended, Dumbledore alone understood what it meant, that Harry had unknowingly destroyed a piece of Voldemort's soul, that the boy's connection to the Dark Lord was deeper than anyone realized, and that this battle had been another step in a war that had never truly ended. For Voldemort himself, still clinging to life far away, the loss of the diary was a blow, because it had been more than a Horcrux. It had been a weapon, a doorway back into the school he had once loved and hated in equal measure, and its destruction only hardened his resolve to return in full, to rise again, no longer a shade or a memory, but flesh and power restored, because he believed he was destined for nothing less. The years after the fall of the diary passed with Voldemort still a shadow, weaker than he had ever been, lingering in Albania, where the forests closed in, and the ruins of old castles gave him cover. He was nothing but a whisper in the dark, clinging to snakes for company and to the fragments of his Horcruxes for anchor. And yet even in this state, his will did not fade. He hated the shape he had been reduced to, hated the helplessness, and he dreamed of the day when he would walk again in a body that could command fear with a glance. The chance came when Peter Pettigrew, the traitor who had betrayed the Potters, crawled back to him in disgrace, hiding from both Death Eaters who saw him as a coward, and from the Order who saw him as a rat. And Pettigrew, desperate to belong somewhere, followed whispers and rumors, until he found his master again. Not the dark figure he remembered, but something far more terrible, a broken spirit, with red eyes glowing in the dark, and even in that pitiful form, Voldemort bent him to his will, because fear and loyalty are not so different when they are mixed with desperation. Together they began to plan, and Voldemort explained what was needed: a ritual of old magic, forbidden, cruel, but powerful enough to restore him to flesh. And for that he would need 3 things: the bone of the father, the flesh of the servant, and the blood of the enemy, each taken and bound in fire, each feeding his broken body until it was made whole again. And Pettigrew, eager to prove himself, set out to prepare every step. They built their plot in secret, waiting for the right moment. And it came during the Triwizard Tournament, when Harry Potter was drawn into the contest by magic deeper than anyone suspected, a perfect chance to pull the boy into the hands of the Dark Lord. And so Pettigrew and his master set their plan, twisting the contest until its end would lead Harry straight to the graveyard of Little Hangleton, where the Riddle family lay buried. The night of the 3rd task came, the hedges of the maze closing in on the champions, spells flashing in the dark, and at the center the Triwizard Cup gleamed. But when Harry and Cedric Diggory grasped it together, it was no prize. It was a portkey, and they were torn from the pitch and flung into the graveyard where shadows waited, and the air was heavy with the smell of earth and death. There Pettigrew struck, killing Cedric with a single curse, the boy falling lifeless beside Harry, and Harry was bound, forced to watch as Pettigrew carried out the ritual, digging bone from the grave of Tom Riddle's Senior, slicing his own flesh to give to the cauldron, and then cutting Harry's arm to spill his blood, the blood that Voldemort had long desired, the blood that carried the protection of Lily's sacrifice. And as the fire roared and the smoke rose, a body began to form, pale skin stretching over bone, red eyes glowing, and with a final cry, Lord Voldemort stood again in flesh, tall and terrible, his long fingers gripping his wand as if it had never left his hand. He called his followers, the Death Eaters apparating into the circle, masks gleaming, and they fell to their knees before him, some trembling, some daring to glance up, and he walked among them with scorn, punishing those who had failed him, rewarding those who had waited, reminding them all that their lives belonged to him. And as he spoke, the world seemed to shrink around the graveyard, because the nightmare that had fallen years before was alive again. Then he turned to Harry, the boy who had undone him, the boy who had been marked by prophecy, and he forced him into a duel, explaining to all that he would kill him before their eyes. And yet when their spells met, the twin cores of their wands bound together in a strange magic, a thread of light connecting them, and from Voldemort's wand echoes of his past victims emerged. James, Lily, Cedric, shadows that shielded Harry long enough for him to escape, tearing free from the graveyard and vanishing back to Hogwarts with Cedric's body in his arms. The wizarding world gasped when Harry told them the truth. Voldemort was back. The Dark Lord lived again, but the Ministry refused to believe. Fear made them blind, and Voldemort, smiling in the shadows, used their denial as cover, gathering his forces ready to unleash a second war, even greater than the first, because now he had his body again, and with it the certainty that nothing, not even death itself, could hold him. Voldemort returned to a world that refused to see him, and that refusal served him better than any cloak, because while the Ministry stood in front of cameras and declared that everything was fine, that the boy was mistaken, that the reports were rumors blown out of shape, he moved through the dark like a rising tide, calling back his followers, testing their loyalty, punishing those who hid behind excuses, and setting in motion the slow, careful work of rebuilding a war machine that had once brought Britain to its knees. He knew that fear was strongest when wrapped in doubt, so he let the Ministry argue with itself, let the newspapers mock Harry and Dumbledore, let the public tell themselves that the nightmares were simply stories from a frightened child. And in that soft denial, he planted roots. He reached out to families that had once carried his mark and told them the old promises were good again: power for obedience, privilege for silence. And he gathered new believers too, the ones who had been children during the First War and had grown up on tales of his strength, who had learned to mistake cruelty for certainty and prejudice for pride. He needed money, safe houses, channels of information, and he set his followers to each task. Some stole from vaults, some bought officials with favors, others simply smiled in the right corridors and collected whispers, and he kept them sharp by reminding them what failure cost: a flick of his wand, a mark that burned, a family member who simply did not come home. And if anyone hesitated, he would repeat the lesson until the hesitation vanished. Meanwhile, Dumbledore worked to form the answer: the Order of the Phoenix, gathering again in hidden rooms, sending warnings to those most at risk, hiding witnesses, protecting the few who spoke the truth. But the Order was small compared to the web that Voldemort wove, and Voldemort had found new cracks to widen, because the Ministry itself was no longer a wall against him but a door partly open. He had sympathizers in offices with clean floors and bright lamps, men and women who disliked the thought of Dumbledore's power, who believed that keeping calm mattered more than facing danger, and he used them as shields while he sharpened his knife. He was not careless. He had learned from the night the curse rebounded. He understood that destiny could coil around a single child. So he struck sideways, not head-on. He sent Dementors to test the edges of the law, spreading cold hunger in Muggle streets, hoping to force the Ministry into foolishness. And it worked. The Minister waved away every warning until the evidence was a chill that could not be denied. And even then he chose to blame the messengers, because admitting Voldemort's return would mean admitting his own failure. Voldemort also wanted proof that his legend still carried weight, and he chose a target that would echo through every home. He sent his followers to pluck prisoners from Azkaban itself, tearing open the walls with storm and fury. And the Dementors, long since disloyal to the Ministry and loyal only to despair, opened the gates to him, and in a single night, the worst of the old Death Eaters walked free again, crazed and eager and ready to wear their masks with pride. The papers finally shouted that something was wrong. But again the Ministry spun and stalled, and that bought Voldemort more time. He began to reach beyond Britain, calling on contacts across Europe, stirring giants to his cause with promises of revenge, whispering to werewolves hungry for chaos, offering them prey and position if they tore at the edges of the peace. And with every pledge he gained, he tightened the circle around the one place he could not ignore: Hogwarts, because even if Dumbledore had refused him the post, even if the school had once pushed him away, he still believed the castle belonged to him by right of blood and fear. Inside Hogwarts, the students felt the pressure building even before officials admitted anything had changed. Owls flew with heavy messages at dawn. Parents wrote letters edged with worry, and the staff kept eyes on the doors as if an old enemy might step through at any moment. And Harry, who had seen the graveyard with his own eyes, carried the weight of being disbelieved. He walked through corridors where whispers followed him, and Voldemort took satisfaction in that, because to wound the boy without touching him was a clean pleasure, the kind that softened a target before the strike. Voldemort also moved to secure artifacts and knowledge he had not yet claimed. He sent agents into old houses to search for heirlooms. He pried at the bonds of ancient families, sometimes with bribes and sometimes with bribes and sometimes with curses, and he tested the edges of prophecy again, asking his spies to listen at doors in the Department of Mysteries, because the words spoken years before still clung to him like a brand. And he wanted certainty. He wanted the piece of truth he had missed, the part that had allowed a baby to break him. His meetings with his followers became rituals of fear and devotion. He stood beneath ceilings black with smoke, and they knelt in a circle, masks lowered, hands shaking as he passed. And he spoke softly, promising a world redrawn in his image, a world where the pure would rule and the rest would serve. And every time he said these words, he felt the hollow inside him briefly fill, as if he could build a cathedral around the break in his soul and call it victory. But even as his voice flowed, a thin thread of caution pulled at him, because Dumbledore remained the one opponent he had never beaten, not in debate, not in magic, and so he avoided direct clash for now, preferring to weaken the old wizard through politics and doubt. He sent rumors like arrows, spoke to the frightened through proxies, turned friends into critics, and when those tricks were not enough, he chose targets that would force Dumbledore's attention away from the center, fires to fight, homes to shield, little wars meant to carve time from the man who had the only mind Voldemort respected as an obstacle. Night by night, the world slid closer to the edge, while most people told themselves it was all still normal, and that suited Voldemort beautifully, because revolutions work best in silence until the shout becomes unavoidable, and the shout was coming. He could feel it in the way the mark on his followers burned quicker, in the way owls returned with answers that pleased him, in the way the ministry began to crack in public, its leaders snapping at each other, its auras stretched thin, its laws bent into shapes that served fear rather than justice. And through it all, he kept his gaze on Harry Potter, not because of revenge alone, but because the boy was a symbol that weakened him. Every time people told the story of the child who survived the killing curse, they remembered that Voldemort could fail, and Voldemort could not bear that idea resting in anyone's mind. So he began to plan not just to kill the boy, but to unmake the idea of him, to trap him, break him, and display the ruin as a lesson to anyone who might dream of resistance. The Second Wizarding War did not begin with a single blast of light. It began with 1,000 small decisions made in shadows, with letters sent at midnight and laws twisted before breakfast, with the escape of prisoners and the smearing of truth, and with a name that people pretended not to hear while they locked their doors a little earlier each evening. And in that spreading quiet, Voldemort smiled, because denial is a ladder for monsters, and he had never climbed fast. The return of Voldemort did not begin with explosions or open war. It began with whispers that crept through back alleys and drawing rooms, the ministry still clinging to its denial, while the Dark Lord's hand stretched further each night, and those who had once knelt before him returned with the eagerness of dogs called home, eager to prove that they had never wavered, eager to show their loyalty before his fury found them. The ministry's refusal to believe Harry's warning gave Voldemort the perfect shield. Cornelius Fudge stood in public and laughed at the idea of the Dark Lord's return. Newspapers printed sneers, and the wizarding world lulled itself into a dangerous calm, all while Death Eaters moved in the shadows, rebuilding the networks that had rotted away after his fall. And in drawing rooms lit by green fire, the mark burned once again on pale arms, calling old followers back into his circle. Inside Hogwarts, the year pressed on, with the Triwizard victory turned into tragedy. Cedric Diggory's death muttered about as a freak accident, Harry's warnings dismissed as grief, and Voldemort watched from afar as the very people who should have united against him instead turned on each other, their fear and stubbornness giving him space to breathe and to grow. And he smiled at the weakness of men who believed that refusing to see the storm would keep them dry. While the ministry issued decrees and argued in chambers, Voldemort prepared in silence, sending his followers to infiltrate, to recruit, to test the loyalty of old allies, and to punish those who dared refuse. Giants once driven to the mountains were coaxed back with promises of blood and freedom. Dementors abandoned their posts at Azkaban, their chills spreading across the countryside in silent proof that the old master had returned, and Voldemort himself remained hidden, his strategy patient, waiting for the moment when fear would be strongest. Every step was deliberate. He tested his reach at the Department of Mysteries, for it was there that the prophecy still lay, the words that had first marked Harry as his equal. And though his followers struck hard, they were resisted, Harry and his friends fighting with desperation that surprised even the Death Eaters. And the night ended with Sirius Black falling into the Veil, a loss that cut Harry deeply. But for Voldemort it was a sign, because the prophecy was now closer to his hand than it had ever been before. Dumbledore's duel with him that night in the Ministry atrium shook the very walls, fire and water clashing with green light, statues shattering under the weight of spells, and though neither fell, the sight of the Dark Lord returned at last, left the Ministry no choice but to admit the truth this, the war had begun again. The second rising of Lord Voldemort was no longer a rumor, but a fact too large to be smothered under paper and speeches. From that moment, the wizarding world changed. The Ministry scrambled to save face. Auras were stretched thin, and families whispered about which neighbors might be safe and which might be watching. The fear that Voldemort had always understood so well spread faster than fire, and his name once again became a silence on people's lips. Because to speak it was to risk being heard. He had returned, stronger and sharper than before, no longer a shadow clinging to a servant, no longer a diary's echo or a phantom in the forest, but a man reborn with the full measure of his cruelty. And as he gathered his circle, he looked not only at Harry Potter, but at the whole of the wizarding world, determined to bend it until it broke. The veil of denial had been torn away, and the truth of Voldemort's return could no longer be hidden. And with that truth came the first open waves of the Second Wizarding War. A war that did not start with grand battles, but with fear seeping into every crack of daily life. Whispers in pubs, shadows in the sky, doors locked earlier each night. And as people tried to go on with their lives, Voldemort was already inside their world, pulling strings, bending the Ministry, and turning trust into suspicion. He knew that fear worked best when it seemed to come from everywhere at once. So his Death Eaters moved in silence, placing imperious curses on officials, buying influence with threats whispered in the dark, punishing whole families for the choices of one member, until the wizarding world was caught in a net of fear, so fine that most people did not even see it until it closed around their throats. And while the auras scrambled to respond, they found themselves chasing shadows because Voldemort had made sure the real work was hidden behind layers of deception. Attacks on Muggles grew common, bridges collapsing, fires that could not be put out, disappearances that the newspapers barely mentioned, and every act served two purposes: to feed Voldemort's need for chaos, and to remind the wizarding world that their safety was an illusion, that he could reach them anywhere. And every scream in the night became a signal that the Dark Lord's hand was strong again, even as the Ministry insisted it still held control. Inside Hogwarts, the children could feel it too. Though the castle walls were thick, they carried letters from home that spoke of relatives missing, of parents afraid, of neighbors whispering about disappearances, and Voldemort himself had little need to step inside the school now. He knew that his influence was enough, that the very idea of him was shaping the minds of the next generation, bending them toward fear or loyalty depending on which house they listened to. The Ministry finally broke under his pressure. Its leaders silenced, its structure bent, until it served him more than it resisted. And soon, the very place that had once been the symbol of law became a tool of oppression. Trials held under cold arches where verdicts were already decided, Muggle-born witches and wizards dragged forward as if they were thieves for daring to hold a wand. Dementors hovering above them while masked Death Eaters stood as judges, and Voldemort smiled from afar, because he had remade the Ministry without needing to plant his flag above its doors. Every victory fed his pride, and yet he never forgot the prophecy. never forgot that one boy had survived the curse that no one else had. So while he tightened his grip on Britain, he also turned his attention back to Harry Potter, determined not only to kill him, but to shatter the legend of the boy who lived. Because Voldemort knew that symbols mattered, and Harry's very existence was a wound that undermined his claim to absolute power. When the Order of the Phoenix tried to protect Harry by moving him from his relative's home, Voldemort saw the chance to strike, and he took to the skies himself, flying without broom or beast, a serpent through the storm, his wand raised and his rage sharp. And though Harry escaped that night, though Hedwig fell and others paid the price, the message was clear. The Dark Lord himself would not wait behind masks and servants any longer. He would come with his own hand and his own curse, because this war was personal. The world now lived in the open shadow of his name, and every home, every alley, every whisper of the Daily Prophet carried the truth that Lord Voldemort had returned, and that he was not content to haunt graveyards or forests any longer. He was here, he was everywhere, and he was waiting for the moment when his hold on Hogwarts itself would be complete. When Voldemort finally pulled the Ministry fully into his grasp, the change was not announced with banners or speeches. It happened in silence and in shadows. One morning, the Ministry simply no longer belonged to the people who worked there. Its doors opened to the same atrium, its lifts clanged the same way, the same memos flew through the air, but the voices in the corridors spoke softer, the footsteps echoed sharper, and the fear that had once crept in now ruled openly, because behind every desk there might be a mask hidden in a drawer, and behind every smile there might be the knowledge that the Dark Lord was listening. It began with the fall of the minister himself, a man who had laughed in public and called Harry Potter a liar. Cornelius Fudge toppled by his own cowardice, and then Rufus Scrimgeour, who fought harder but still fell when Voldemort's grip closed too tight, and in their place rose Pius Thickness, a puppet who spoke with the voice of authority, but whose mind was chained by the imperious curse, and on him Voldemort did not need to declare his rule. He simply gave commands that were repeated as if they were law, and the wizarding world was too frightened to resist. Under this new ministry, Muggle-born witches and wizards were dragged into hearings that were not trials but sentences, accused of stealing their magic from those of pure blood, their wands snapped, their names struck from records, Dementors hovering over them as if they were already guilty, and families that once thought themselves safe learned that safety had no meaning, because when the dark mark burned in the sky above a street, it did not matter how pure your blood was. It mattered only whether Voldemort had decided you were useful or whether you were in his way. The Daily Prophet became another mask, its headlines twisted to praise the Ministry's new order, its pages filled with lies about Harry Potter, branding him undesirable number one, his picture plastered in black and white with words beneath promising gold for his capture, and Voldemort smiled, because he knew that the boy was already hunted by fear itself, that every step Harry took beyond hiding was a risk of betrayal, and that even those who might have helped him now hesitated, because loyalty to Harry meant danger from Voldemort. The Order of the Phoenix worked in silence, their numbers too small to fight openly, meeting in darkened rooms with wards layered thick over the walls, protecting those they could, hiding the ones the Ministry called criminals. But the Order bled slowly, its members hunted, its safe houses exposed, and Voldemort's reach seemed endless, because he had built his empire not only with curses, but with the poison of suspicion. And suspicion spreads faster than fire, while his followers spread terror. Voldemort himself turned his eyes to Hogwarts once more. He had no need to walk its halls openly yet, but he wanted its headmaster's chair. He wanted the school that had rejected him to serve as his throne. And so Severus Snape, who had played his dangerous double game for years, was placed there, headmaster by decree, with the Carrows at his side to enforce Voldemort's vision, turning lessons into indoctrination, turning punishment into torture, and the castle that had once been a sanctuary for children became another tool of fear. But for all his control, Voldemort's mind never strayed far from Harry Potter. The boy who had escaped again and again, the boy who was the living proof that the killing curse could fail, and as much as Voldemort had domination of the wizarding world, he wanted more than anything to break that symbol, to kill Harry, not just as a man, but as an idea, to prove to every witch and wizard that no legend could stand against him. So he hunted him, sending snatchers into the countryside, combing through villages and forests, spreading word of rewards, chasing rumors, and though Harry, Ron, and Hermione moved in secret, their faces hidden, their campfires cold, the net around them tightened with every passing day, because Voldemort had painted a target so large that no one could ignore it, and every bounty hunter, every coward, every desperate soul became another eye searching for the boy who lived. At the same time, Voldemort sought something deeper, something even his closest followers did not fully understand. The wand that was said to be unbeatable, the Elder Wand, one of the Deathly Hallows, a relic of legend, and in his arrogance, he believed that if he held it in his hand, then no magic could ever stop him, that with it he would finally kill Harry Potter without risk. And so he chased its trail, tearing through Europe, questioning wand makers, striking down those who resisted until he found his path leading back to Hogwarts once again. The world outside saw only the smoke, the fear, the names printed in obituaries, the faces missing from the breakfast table, but beneath it all, Voldemort's shadow grew, stretching across Britain until it seemed no light could escape it, and the people who once dared speak his name aloud now whispered less than ever, because this time the Dark Lord was not a rumor. He was everywhere, and the silence was not denial. It was survival. Voldemort's new empire was built on fear and paper and the quiet betrayal of polite people, but the core of it was still the wand in his hand. And the more he fought, the more he understood that power lived not only in spells and followers, but in the wood and core that answered your grip. He had returned with the same hue and phoenix feather that had served him since Tom Riddle first felt a spark run through his fingers. Yet the graveyard had exposed a flaw he could not forgive when his curse met the boy's magic. The twin cores tangled, the stream of light bound him, and the dead spoke from the tip of his wand like a taunt. So he began to hunger for a weapon that would never fail, a wand that legend called unbeatable, and once the ministry lay under his thumb, he had the reach to search for it in the open, and the patience to tear up every root of story until only truth remained. He started with wand lore the way a general studies maps, dragging makers from their benches and pressing them until their voices shook. Ollivander had already been taken and kept, like a book on a shelf that only he could read. But there were others across Europe, men and women who had whispered for years about a master wand that passed from hand to hand in a trail of ruin. Some called it the Death Stick, some the Wand of Destiny, all warned that it answered not to purchase but to conquest, and each time he heard those words, Voldemort's mouth curved because conquest was the only language he trusted. The trail led to Gregorovitch, who once boasted that he held the wand, and Voldemort pried into the old man's memories, found a flash of a thief leaping from a window, a pale boy with bright hair and fierce eyes who laughed as he fled with the prize clutched tight. A name from the history books answered that face, Gellert Grindelwald, the Dark Star who had ruled part of Europe before Dumbledore broke him, and in an instant the path bent toward the only opponent Voldemort still treated with caution, even in death. Before Voldemort could seize that relic, he had to reckon with the last obstacle that had ever stood in his way. Because the world he was remaking still carried the echo of one night when the tower at Hogwarts drank lightning and a figure fell from the sky. The fall of Albus Dumbledore had been planned with care and carried out with a choreography of lies. A cursed ring that had burned his hand black and bled his strength. A plan with Severus Snape written into its bones. The old man walking into the dark with eyes wide open because he knew that his death would buy time and cover and a chance to prepare the boy to hunt the Horcruxes that tied the Dark Lord to earth. And Voldemort looked upon that fall as both victory and challenge. Victory because the only wizard he feared was gone. Challenge because even dead the old man seemed to place pieces on the board that moved against him. That night had ended with shock rolling through the castle. Students sobbing in corridors while the dark mark smeared green above the tower, and Snape swept away with his face a locked door. And for months afterward, the wizarding world learned to live without the man who had once steadied it. Parents wrote letters that trembled. The order bent under weight it could barely carry. And yet Voldemort did not take the school in that instant. He was patient. He understood that the symbol had to be turned to his service fully, not simply conquered with a rush of masked figures. So he waited until the ministry fell and then laid the headmaster's office under Snape's hand with the Carrows to twist every lesson. And he allowed children to learn the shape of fear each morning, so that when he finally walked the grounds as master, there would be no need for speeches, only silence. But the wand still pulled at him like a hook in the ribs, because if the Elder Wand existed and if it had been held by Grindelwald, then it had also been taken from Grindelwald by Dumbledore. And if Dumbledore died still its true master, then the wand's allegiance might sleep inside his tomb the way a sword sleeps in stone. And the idea that a dead man could still deny him gnawed at Voldemort more than any rumor of prophecy. So he went first to Nurmengard, where the once brilliant tyrant who had dazzled half a continent sat in a bare cell with snow drifting past the window. Grindelwald's smile was a shard of the boy he had been, and when Voldemort asked for the wand, the prisoner answered with a taunt, a hint, a glimmer of challenge. He said that Voldemort would never truly master it. He said that the wand was beyond him, and even as the green light ended that old rival's breath, the words lingered like ash, driving Voldemort to the last place he wanted to admit he must go. He returned to Britain with rage, refined into purpose, crossed the lake at night while the castle slept under a sky that held its stars like coins, and walked among the graves as if strolling through a library. And at the white tomb of Albus Dumbledore, he lifted his wand and broke stone like bread. There in that sudden wound in the earth lay the Elder Wand, pale wood gleaming with a quiet that felt like refusal. He took it, raised it, tested the air. The hiss of power skated along his fingers, and for a moment he believed that destiny itself had clicked into place. Yet power without allegiance is a promise with a trap inside it. And the first time the wand threw sparks under his command, he felt the answer was incomplete. It obeyed, but it did not bow. Voldemort did not speak that doubt aloud. He told his followers the legend had come true. He let them see the wand that stories feared. He raised it in meetings where masks lined the walls, and promised that the last obstacle would fall. He told them Hogwarts would open its doors to him, that the boy would be flushed from whatever hole he hid in, that the world would accept its new shape or be broken to fit. And his voice was so calm and certain that even men who had watched him fail once before believed, because belief is easier than courage when the room is full of people nodding. Inside the school, Snape played his tightrope, a shape gliding through corridors while the Carrows shouted lessons about blood and obedience. Children learned to keep their heads down. Some learned to fight in secret rooms. and the walls themselves carried rumors like drafts that the Elder Wand had been stolen from a dead man's hands, that the Dark Lord held fate in his fingers now, that the last hope was leaving, and Voldemort drank those rumors like wine, because rumor is a weapon too. It wears people down before the first spell is cast. Yet even as he prepared his final siege, the details of allegiance returned to his thoughts like a thorn he could not ignore. Wandlore said that mastery passed not from owner to thief, but from master to conqueror, that a wand chooses, that a wand remembers, and if Dumbledore had been disarmed, not by death, but by a living hand before the night on the tower, then the wand's loyalty might have jumped like a spark to another branch entirely. So Voldemort demanded reports from anyone who had been there. He sifted memories for the instant when Dumbledore lost control of the Elder Wand's allegiance. He stared into the past, looking for the small hinge on which all doors turn, and the more he looked, the more one name walked through his thoughts. Not the boy this time, but the man who had carried out the fall, Severus. If Snape had taken the tower as his stage and Dumbledore as his victim, then perhaps the wand now bowed to him. And if that were true, then the obedience Voldemort required was not yet his, which was intolerable, because he had framed his new empire as inevitable, and there is nothing more fragile than inevitability, when a single detail can undo it. So he made plans within plans, how to extract what he needed from Snape, how to ensure the wand at last aligned its deep memory with the hand that deserved it, and he did this while the search for the boy continued. Snatchers combing roads, posters curling in rain, whispers that Harry Potter was moving and that the blade of legend had awakened somewhere beyond the hedgerows. In these months, the fear around Britain became a weather system that never cleared. Muggles felt it as a pressure they could not name. Wizards felt it as a constant tightness in the chest that woke them at night, and Hogwarts itself breathed shallow because the castle had never loved the hand that now directed it. Yet even a place with a soul can be made to kneel under sufficient cruelty, and that was Voldemort's specialty. He believed that enough pressure makes truth irrelevant. He believed that the right wand in the right hand makes every door open. He believed it so completely that when he stood in front of the broken tomb holding the Elder Wand up to the night sky, he felt certain that the end had already been written. What he did not see, or did not want to see, was the network of quiet decisions collecting against him. House elves whispering, goblins making uneasy bargains, students passing messages in coin and quill, portraits listening, centaurs watching the tree line, and a worn trio carrying a map of his soul in their heads. But doubt was not a language he spoke. Certainty had carried him from a cold orphanage cot to a throne made of fear, and certainty told him that an unbeatable wand in the hands of a wizard who had clawed his way back from the edge of nothing would be enough to silence prophecy and memory and resistance all in one stroke. So, he set the board for the last act. He sent word that the net must close. He instructed the Carrows to tighten their grip. He commanded Snape to keep the school in line while he prepared the blow that would end the symbol of the boy forever. And as he walked the corridors of his new ministry with the Elder Wand hidden in his sleeve, he felt taller, brighter, more inevitable. The old fear of death quiet for the first time in years, and the thought that a dead man might still work against him faded into a dull irritation that he promised himself he would erase in a single evening, once he had taken care of one necessary task. Because if the wand truly belonged to Snape, then the wand must be convinced. And Voldemort, who had never once asked for loyalty when he could take it, already knew how he would act. Voldemort's certainty in the Elder Wand's power did not erase his unease, because the more he thought about wand lore, the more he understood that true mastery rested not only in possession, but in allegiance, and the possibility that Snape or another had claimed that allegiance gnawed at him like hunger. Yet he pressed forward because he had no choice. He had already declared himself master of death to his followers, and he could not allow even a hint of doubt to spread among them. So he spoke with calm pride at every gathering, lifting the wand as proof that destiny had placed the final weapon in his hand, even as inside he rehearsed the ways he might force it to obey him fully. The hunt for Harry Potter had now become the axis of his entire strategy, because the boy had grown into more than just an enemy. He was a living reminder of Voldemort's one failure, and in the eyes of the world he was the boy who lived, a symbol that Voldemort could not afford to let survive. So he set snatchers to scour the countryside, offering gold for information, spreading posters that declared Potter undesirable #1, twisting the Ministry's resources into a machine built for one task. And though the boy and his friends moved in silence through forests and fields, each day the circle closed tighter, each rumor weighed with fire, each whisper chased down by loyal ears. At the same time, Voldemort prepared for the moment when secrecy would no longer matter, because he understood that symbols fall most effectively in public. So he dreamed of the final act, not as a duel in shadows, but as a war that would shake the castle that had once denied him. And he saw himself walking through the gates of Hogwarts, as master at last, with the Elder Wand blazing in his hand, and Harry Potter dead at his feet, the legend broken before a crowd that could carry the story to every corner of the wizarding world. The months leading to that vision were filled with pressure on every front. His followers struck deep into homes that still whispered Dumbledore's name. Death Eaters appeared in quiet villages and left behind smoke that rose like signals in the sky. Muggle-born families fled or were dragged into courtrooms where the sentence was written before the trial began. And all the while Voldemort stood apart, guiding with cold precision, never wasting himself when others could carry out the work, reserving his strength for the confrontation that would matter most. Inside Hogwarts, Snape maintained the uneasy balance Voldemort demanded, walking a path between the Carrow's open cruelty and the simmering rebellion among students who met in secret. But to Voldemort, these details were distractions, because his thoughts returned always to the wand, to the prophecy, to the boy, and to the need to prove once and for all that no curse could ever fail him again. He believed that only through Harry's death could he erase the wound of that night in Godric's Hollow. The search for the Elder Wand's true loyalty drove him into darker calculations. He questioned whether Dumbledore's end on the tower had truly passed mastery to Snape, or whether some other hand had struck first. He studied reports of the night, sifted through memories, weighed every possibility, and at last decided that Snape must die. Because if the wand's allegiance lay with him, then only by removing him could Voldemort claim it fully. And so, even as the war raged, his mind carried that cold decision like a stone in his pocket. But before that reckoning, there remained the hunt for the boy. And Voldemort's spies finally carried word that Harry was moving again, slipping through forests, seeking objects, whispering of secrets tied to the Dark Lord himself. And though Voldemort did not yet know that the trio hunted Horcruxes, he sensed the pattern. He felt the danger in the way his anchors seemed threatened, and it sharpened his urgency, because he understood that his immortality was no longer untouchable, that someone was chipping at the foundation of his eternity. So he gathered his forces and drew the net tighter. The sky over Britain filled with dark marks, the streets lined with whispers, the Ministry hollowed out to serve only his will, and the final path began to form, a path that would end not in secrecy, but in the stone halls of the castle that had once called him student and now would call him conqueror. Voldemort's war had spread across every corner of Britain, but for all the smoke in the sky and the fear in the streets, his mind circled back again and again to one question that grew heavier with each night. Was the Elder Wand truly his? Did it serve him as it should? Because when he raised it in practice, it answered yes, but with a subtle resistance that gnawed at him, the feeling of a steed that obeys but does not submit. and that doubt was unbearable to a man who had built his life on the certainty that power must bend entirely to his will. So he planned, and he calculated, and he stared into the fire with red eyes glowing as he decided that Severus Snape must die. Because if the wand had passed from Dumbledore to anyone, it had passed to the man who struck him down on the tower, and Voldemort could not allow another to hold what was meant for him. While that decision hardened, the hunt for Harry Potter pressed closer, because though Voldemort did not yet know the full truth of the trio's mission, he sensed in his bones that they were tearing at the edges of his immortality. Horcruxes vanishing one by one in ways he could not explain, dark anchors gone when he reached for them in his thoughts, and panic, though he never named it panic, began to sharpen his rage. He barked orders, sent snatchers scouring the countryside, offered gold and power to anyone who might drag Potter to him, and all the while the boy moved unseen, slipping through nets, always just beyond reach, which only made Voldemort more determined to crush him publicly. When at last he was caught, the Ministry churned under his control like a machine fed with fear. Trials filled the Great Hall. Dementors drifted close enough for prisoners to gasp for air, and Voldemort watched from afar, satisfied that the very idea of resistance was being strangled. Yet still his mind drifted to Hogwarts, the castle that had defined him, the place where he had first learned the thrill of power and the secret of the chamber, the place that had once denied him the post he desired, and now, with Snape as headmaster and the Carrows enforcing cruelty in the classrooms, he considered it almost his, but not fully, not until he himself walked those halls with none to oppose him, and the boy who haunted his prophecy lying broken at his feet. So he prepared. He gathered every creature and servant he could command, giants who pounded their chests in the mountains, werewolves eager for carnage, Dementors ready to blanket the fields with despair, and Death Eaters who trembled under his gaze, but nodded at every command, and he drew them together like a storm, waiting at the horizon, because he knew that the final act must be written not in whispers or shadows, but in a siege so great that the world would never again doubt his name. At the same time, he kept his plans close, revealing only enough to keep his servants fearful, because he trusted no one, not even the man who sat in the headmaster's chair at his command. And in the quiet hours, Voldemort's thoughts circled Snape like a hawk, because Snape had been too calm, too controlled, his dark eyes never trembling even when the Dark Lord fixed him with questions, and Voldemort's suspicion grew until he was certain that the Elder Wand's obedience could not be his, while Snape lived, and certainty for Voldemort was the same as the night came when he called Snape to him, summoning him with the voice that no one dared refuse, and in the dim of the shrieking shack, with Nagini coiled in her protective cage, Voldemort spoke with the smooth calm of a man who had already decided the end. He thanked Snape for his service, spoke of loyalty and of fate, and then in one swift turn, he commanded the serpent to strike, the great body surging forward, fangs sinking, Snape gasping as the venom burned, and Voldemort watched without expression, convinced that with Snape's death, the wand would at last bend entirely to him, that the thin layer of resistance he felt would vanish like mist in the morning. But as Snape's breaths grew shallow and his blood spread dark across the floor, the man's last thoughts were not of Voldemort, but of the boy, of green eyes he had watched all his life. And as he pressed memories into Harry's hand before the final darkness took him, he gave the truth that Voldemort had never suspected, that the wand's allegiance had never passed to him, that its true master was another, and Voldemort, standing tall and sure, did not yet know that he had sealed his own fate with the very act meant to guarantee his victory. Outside the shack, the battle for Hogwarts had already begun. Death Eaters and giants pressing against the walls, defenders young and old raising wards that shimmered in the night. Teachers shouting spells, students carrying messages, and the castle groaning as if it remembered every war it had seen before. And Voldemort stood on the edge of that storm with the Elder Wand in his hand, and the certainty that at last destiny would be his, unaware that the cracks in his plan had already begun to spread. Night settled over the castle, and then refused to behave like night, because instead of quiet and the soft breath of the lake, there came the distant thud of giants testing the ground, the whisper of Dementors gathering like storm clouds where the forest met the field, the shuffle of armored suits waking after centuries of standing still, and under that rising sound the defenders moved with a speed that felt like a heartbeat turning from rest to a sprint. Teachers drawing chalk lines that burned into wards, portraits rushing from frame to frame carrying quick messages, house elves tugging at sleeves and pressing vials into shaking hands, and the students who had chosen to stay taking positions beside people they had once only known as professors, their eyes too bright and their voices too steady for their years as they repeated instructions and braced themselves for the first blow. From his vantage, beyond the gates, Voldemort watched the castle glow with the last warmth of safety, and he called his followers near, the ring of Death Eaters closing around him, masks gleaming in the torchlight, giants stomping eagerly, werewolves pacing, the snake he trusted most coiling in its cage beside him, and he spoke with the calm of a man who believed the outcome had been written since the day he understood the word destiny. He told them that this night would end with a new dawn, that the castle would kneel, that the boy would die, that those who stood with him would be remembered as the hands that remade the world, and the air itself seemed to shiver as the dark mark rose above the towers like a wound opening in the sky. Inside the great hall, Professor McGonagall's voice carried like iron wrapped in cloth as she assigned tasks. Flitwick lifted his small hands and the stones hummed. Sprout dragged crates of venomous pods to the windows and grinned with a fierceness that looked like sunlight seen through thorns, and Kingsley and Lupin moved among the defenders, tightening lines, while the Weasleys stood together like a wall with gaps where those already lost should have been. And though fear walked beside every person in that room, they treated it like a guest to be guided, not a master to be obeyed, because there was no time left to tremble. The wards were already straining, the tremor of the first assault passing through floor and bench and bone. The initial strike was not subtle, giants charging like living siege engines, clubs slamming into ancient stone while the wards flashed and bled sparks that sliced the night. The Dementors sweeping down in waves that turned breath into frost and thought into despair, until Patronices burst from wands like silver fire. Wolves howling as they rushed the walls and were driven back by blasts that rang like bells. And above it all, the sky cracked with curses, red and green thrown in arcs that painted brief, cruel rainbows over the towers, and the ground answered with its own light, as the defenders returned every blow with a precision born from necessity, because there is no teacher sharper than danger when it stands at your door. The castle fought too. Staircases shifting to block corridors where masks tried to pour in, doors sealing without touch, ropes whipping down from rafters as if the room itself had remembered how to protect its children, and somewhere far below the kitchens exploded into organized chaos, house elves arming themselves with knives and ladles and fury, muttering that no one would harm their students while they still had hands to swing and words to say. And this chorus of defiance built into a rhythm that held even as the first losses came, names shouted that suddenly had no answer, faces turned to the floor and covered with coats because there was no time for more than a promise whispered between breaths that they would be remembered when the sun came back. Voldemort watched the wards bend and sensed the places where they would break. He pushed harder, sending a dozen masked figures to test the courtyard, while giants hammered at the north wall, and he let the Dementors nest thick over the lake to freeze the hope out of anyone who dared cross. And when he felt the first seam split, he smiled, raising the Elder Wand and unleashing a chord of power that struck like a spear into the heart of the defenses. The sound of it rolled across the grounds and made even the bravest flinch, because it felt like an old promise coming due. The promise that death would have its payment, and that the man who had named himself master of it had come to collect. Still, the defenders did not fold. In the courtyard, a knot of fighters surged forward, armor clanging as the statues McGonagall had awakened, marched shoulder to shoulder, fists smashing into giants' knees, while centaurs loosed arrows from the tree line, the shafts burning where they struck, and Hagrid's great shape moved where the press was worst, hauling rubble aside so trapped students could scramble free, shouting orders between gritted teeth while Fang barked furiously at anything in a mask, and above the battlements the twins and Lee sent fireworks screaming into the night that burst like phoenixes and dragons, both beautiful and violent. Sparks falling on Death Eaters who swore and stumbled as color blinded them for a breath that the defenders used like a gift. The battle did not stay in clean lines. It lapped and churned like dark water around each tower, flooding through a broken window here, pouring down a staircase there, and teachers who had spent their lives writing on blackboards now fought as if every day had been training for this hour. Flitwick dueling two at once on a narrow ledge, Sprout flinging plants that wrapped themselves around ankles and wrists and then tightened with a will of their own. Slughorn striding into the Great Hall in a borrowed set of armor that somehow fit, rallying those too stunned to move, until they remembered they were not alone. And through it all, messages moved like veins carrying blood. Owls and ghosts and living runners passing words that shifted defenders to the right place at the right time, with seconds to spare. As the wards fell tower by tower, Voldemort called for a pause, his voice sliding over the grounds with the ease of a man who knows he will be heard. He offered terms that sounded like mercy and tasted like ash, demanded the boy, promised that the rest could live if they surrendered the symbol he hated. And for a breath the castle went quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a scream and wonders if another one is coming. But the answer returned from the stones, and the people both was no, not while we can still stand. And when the refusal reached him, Voldemort's face emptied of all pretense, and he loosed the next wave with a fury that marked the night into before and after. The Dementors came hardest then, the temperature dropping so fast that breath became knives and hope cracked like ice on a pond. Students staggered, fighters bent double as memories of their worst days rose around them like fog that whispered. And then the silver light returned, Fawkes and Stag and Otter and Hare galloping along the battlements, a blazing line that cut the darkness and forced the cold back step by step. And somewhere to the east, a roar of satisfaction rolled across the lawns as giants on the enemy side stumbled under a sudden rain of boulders, the very mountains seeming to answer the call against them, while the forbidden forest shook with movement as creatures that rarely took sides chose one, because even wild things have memories of kindness and cruelty and will lean toward the hand that did not strike them. Voldemort paced within his circle and felt how close the scales were. Victory certain yet not yet complete, and the not yet angered him. He raised the Elder Wand again and drove a spear of light into the defenses of the Great Hall, stone cracking, windows bursting, candles flaring, and dying in a single breath before relighting as if refusing to admit night could win. And his Death Eaters flowed forward to exploit the breach, duels flashing among overturned benches, sparks carving charred lines into the floor, while at the dais a small group stood like anchors in a storm, drawing attackers and breaking them, sending them stumbling back through doors that slammed behind them with a will of their own. Through every corridor ran the choice that defines battles and lives, to flee or to stand. And again the answer was to stand. Not because people believed they could not die, but because they believed some things had to outlast them, and this belief pushed back hard enough that the night did not swallow the castle, despite the weight that pressed from every side. And though names were added to the list of the fallen faster than any heart should have to bear, the line held in enough places that dawn became possible, a pale image on the edge of thought that felt like a hand on the shoulder, saying, "Keep going. One more moment, one more spell, one more step." Voldemort felt the rumor of morning and grew impatient. He sent for Nagini's cage and kept it near. He calculated which parts of the castle mattered most to break next. He listened for the thread that would lead him to the boy, because under all his strategy and all his grandeur, the same hunger that had driven him as a child still burned, the need to be the only will that counted, and he believed that breaking Hogwarts while the boy watched would make the final moment sweeter. He imagined stepping through shattered doors into a silence where even the portraits did not dare whisper, and he tightened his hand on the wand, as if squeezing could wring obedience from legend. Inside, messages raced that the wounded needed moving, that a corridor had to be cleared, that a group was cut off near the clock tower, and people who had not slept for hours ran until their legs trembled, carried stretchers until their arms failed, handed wands to those who had broken theirs, and took up broken ones themselves because any spark was better than none. And when the bell struck by accident in the chaos, its note rolled over the grounds like a reminder that time still existed and had not given itself to Voldemort, no matter what he believed. The night stretched, the fighting surged, and somewhere near the heart of the castle, a stone repeated an old prayer. It had learned from a mason long dead, "Hold, hold, hold," and whether or not stones can think, the walls did hold. Enough for breath, enough for another volley, enough for people to look at one another and find that they were still there. And in that tiny victory, a kind of courage grew that was not loud but deep, the sort that lasts long after speeches fade, and Voldemort sensed it and hated it, because it was the one resource he could not steal with threats or replace with numbers. So he made a new choice, not subtle, not patient. He would bring the boy to him by force of despair. He would offer a final hour for surrender, not as mercy but as theater. And if the boy did not come, he would tear the castle down stone by stone until the last scream was quiet. And this decision passed through his ranks like a chill and through the defenders like a knife, because both sides recognized the moment when a battle turns into a reckoning, and the air grew sharp with anticipation, as if the night itself held its breath to see which story would be told when the sun rose. The siege did not end there, but the shape of it was set, and in the pause that followed, people found water, tightened bandages, counted heads, and did not say certain names out loud. They leaned on walls that were warm from fire and from bodies, and promised each other, with looks that were older than the faces that wore them, that they would go back out when the word came, while outside the Dark Lord stood with the Elder Wand pointing toward a castle that still stood, and told himself that it stood only because he had not yet chosen to make it fall. And he drew a deep breath as if the night were his to drink, and prepared to speak words that would push the story toward its sharpest point. The castle stood half-shattered by the night's assault, its wards frayed and its walls smoking where curses had struck. And in the brief pause that followed Voldemort's command for silence, the defenders gathered in the great hall to count their living and their lost, voices hushed, eyes darting to doors as if expecting the next wave to crash in at any moment. And among them were children far too young to have seen so much, yet standing with jaws set because choice had been taken from them. Fight now or fall. And this determination unsettled Voldemort more than he admitted, because courage that does not break quickly has a way of growing like flame. But he believed he had the answer. He would break not the castle walls, but the hearts inside them. So his voice rolled once more across the grounds, a command woven into the air by magic so that every person heard it as though he whispered into their ear. He told them the battle was already lost, that their friends had died for nothing, that resistance was a game played by fools, and he promised mercy if they delivered him the boy. He demanded Harry Potter, the child who had once survived what no one else could, and he gave them an hour to decide, promising that if the boy did not come, he would level the castle until stone became dust and every name inside became silence. And when his words faded, the night seemed heavier, because hope itself trembled under the weight of that choice. Inside, people shifted uneasily, whispers rising about whether it could be true, whether surrender might save the young still alive. But others stood firm, voices low but certain, saying that Voldemort never gave mercy, that handing over one boy would only delay the blade for the rest. And this argument rippled through the hall, like a wave that refused to settle, grief making some falter while fury hardened others. And above it all, McGonagall's voice cut through again, reminding them that Hogwarts had never surrendered, that the castle itself fought beside them. And slowly heads lifted, shoulders straightened, and the decision was made without a vote. They would hold. In the forest, Voldemort waited, pacing with the Elder Wand in hand, his serpent's cage beside him. Death Eaters forming a restless circle as the minutes slipped away, and his thoughts circled darker still, because though he had shouted his certainty to the night, he knew the boy had slipped him too many times. And so he told himself this time would be different. This time the prophecy would be completed, because he had arranged the stage perfectly, every piece placed, every witness gathered. All he needed was for the boy to walk willingly into his hand, and then at last the world would see that nothing could defy Lord Voldemort and live. And in time the boy did come, walking through the dark trees with no wand raised, his steps steady though his heart beat loud enough for the leaves themselves to hear. And Voldemort saw him, thinner than the legend, paler than the symbol, but still carrying that scar that mocked him. And he lifted the Elder Wand, feeling its weight like the final seal on a story too long delayed. And the clearing fell into a hush deeper than silence as he spoke the words of the curse that had defined him since he first whispered it in a room in Godric's Hollow. Avada Kedavra in light tearing the night open and striking the boy squarely as he fell motionless into the leaves. The forest seemed to exhale in relief. Death Eaters gasped and then laughed, and Voldemort himself felt the thrill of triumph surge through him. The curse had struck true, the boy was still, the prophecy undone, and he stepped forward to look upon the body, red eyes narrowing as if daring it to move, but it did not. And for the first time in years, Voldemort believed he had truly won. He believed that the story of Harry Potter had ended here at his feet, and he smiled as he ordered his servants to lift the body and carry it toward the castle so that every defender inside might see their symbol broken and know despair. The body of Harry Potter was lifted from the forest as if it were nothing, limp arms swaying with each step, and Voldemort followed behind with his wand still raised as though daring the world itself to question what had just happened. And his followers closed in around him in a procession that felt both triumphant and fearful, because none of them had truly believed the boy could fall until they saw him lying there, pale and unmoving, the scar still marked across his forehead, but the light in his eyes gone. And in that sight they found not just relief, but awe, because if the boy who lived had died, then perhaps the Dark Lord was indeed unstoppable. Perhaps he had finally broken the one law that had mocked him for years. As they moved through the forest, shadows stretched long, centaurs watched from the trees with silent contempt, their bows lowered but their eyes sharp, and even they stepped back when the green mark burned overhead, because they too could feel that something had shifted, that the night itself now bent toward the figure striding through it with the Elder Wand in hand and death at his side. And when the gates of the castle came into view, the defenders on the battlements froze, their shouts fading into silence as the small group emerged onto the grounds with their grim prize. Voldemort ordered the body laid before the gates, his voice carrying cold and clear across the distance. and he called to those inside to look, to see the truth with their own eyes, that the boy they had followed, the boy they had trusted, the boy who had defied him more times than anyone else, was gone, broken, lifeless at his feet. And he told them the war was finished, that resistance was pointless, that mercy could still be given if they opened the doors and bowed. And his words rolled through the night like smoke, seeping into every ear, heavy and suffocating. Inside the walls, the great hall was a storm of grief, gasps rising, voices crying out Harry's name, some refusing to believe, some sinking to their knees with hands covering their faces, and the fire of courage that had burned in them faltered as despair poured in, because the symbol they had carried was not just a boy, but a hope that no curse could kill. And now that hope seemed dead, and Voldemort smiled as he saw the wavering, because this was how you ended wars, not with fire alone, but with the breaking of spirit. He stepped forward, his arms spread, his voice rising louder. He promised life to those who would kneel. He promised positions, safety, power to those willing to renounce the order. And one by one, he demanded that the castle choose, surrender or share the fate of the boy lying at their feet. And as his words echoed, the first cracks appeared, a few hands trembling, a few eyes lowering, and the silence grew heavier as people weighed not only their own lives, but the lives of their children, their parents, their friends beside them. Yet even in that silence there were sparks that refused to go out, voices that rose in anger, shouts of defiance from those who had already lost too much to bend now. And as they shouted, Voldemort's smile grew sharper, because he wanted their resistance. He wanted them to cling to hope a little longer, so that when he crushed it, the ruin would be complete. And so he lifted his wand high and ordered another assault. Giants roaring forward, Dementors sweeping low, Death Eaters flooding toward the gates, and he himself followed with slow, measured steps. Savoring the fear that clung to every wall, the battle erupted again. Defenders rallying even in grief, spells flashing, stone cracking, and the body of Harry Potter lying untouched at the edge of it all. A symbol now twisted into a weapon by the man who had killed him, and Voldemort raised the Elder Wand and poured his fury into the walls, blasting stone from the battlements, tearing shields apart, and with each strike he shouted that the end was here, that none could stand against him, that destiny itself had been written in green light in the forest, when the boy who lived became the boy who died. And yet, as the night burned and the castle shook, the defenders still held, because grief can break, but it can also harden. And while Voldemort believed he had ended the story, the truth was still waiting in the heart of the battle, a truth he had not seen, a truth that even now was preparing to rise and undo everything he believed could never be undone. The battle had resumed with a roar, and yet what followed felt like a held breath stretched across the whole castle, because even as Voldemort's followers surged, and the defenders answered with what strength they had left, there was a ripple in the air that no curse could create, a change like the moment before thunder. And it began at the edge of the courtyard, where the body of Harry Potter lay under the torchlight, pale and still and used like a banner of defeat. And then in a motion so small, some thought they imagined it, the boy stirred, eyes opening, breath drawing in as quiet as a secret, and those closest to him reeled backward as if the ground had shifted under their feet, because this was not how endings behaved. This was not how the story was supposed to close. Voldemort had been walking toward the gates with the slow certainty of a man crossing a stage that belongs to him, the Elder Wand high and the night bent to his will, and when the movement at the stone steps broke the pattern, he turned, disbelief flickering and then rage rising to drown it, because he had killed the boy. He had spoken the words and watched the light go out. He had prepared his victory upon that certainty, and to see the symbol he had broken stand again was not simply an interruption, it was an insult flung in his face before a world he intended to rule. The crowd pulled in two directions at once, defenders gasping and then shouting as hope crashed back through them like breath into a drowning chest. Death Eaters stumbling and staring, masks crooked on their faces as if they feared to look directly at what had returned. And for a heartbeat, the battle forgot itself. Spells paused in the air. Dementors circling uncertainly above the towers, and Voldemort's voice cut through this astonishment with the sharpness of glass. He declared that it was a trick. He declared that nothing could undo his curse. He raised the Elder Wand and demanded that every eye look upon him and remember who held power here. Harry moved, not with the swagger of a champion, but with the quiet of someone who understood that the moment belonged not to noise but to truth, and his voice carried from the steps across the courtyard. He spoke of the wand that Voldemort gripped so tightly. He spoke of how wands remember, how allegiance is not stolen by digging through a tomb or taking wood from a dead man's hands. He told them that the wand had been disarmed while Dumbledore still lived upon the tower, that mastery passes through conquest, not through murder, performed at the end of a plan written to fool everyone in the room. And with every word, the Elder Wand seemed to grow heavier in Voldemort's grasp, not in weight but in meaning, because if this was true, then the legend he held was not his to command. Faces across the courtyard turned as the name that tied the story's knot was spoken. Draco Malfoy, a frightened boy on a dark night, disarming a dying headmaster at one point. A motion that had seemed small in the whirlwind of that evening, but which had pulled a thread through fate itself. And then another name followed. Because the wand's loyalty had not stopped in that tower, it had leapt again when a different boy wrenched a wand from Draco's hand weeks later in a place far from these walls. A simple act of survival that had carried an echo he could not have heard then, and the courtyard swallowed this revelation with the shock that accompanies a map suddenly drawn over a landscape you thought you knew. Voldemort spat his refusal, his pride, refusing to bend where reason pressed. He thrust forward the story he preferred, that he was the master of death because he had cut out the part of himself that feared it, because he had scattered his soul into anchors no one could break, because he had taken the Elder Wand from the tomb of the only wizard he had once respected, and therefore fate itself had admitted his right to rule, and he lifted the wand as if to silence all other versions of the tale with light and force. Yet even as he did so, the crowd could feel the imbalance, the tremor in the legend, the way the knight seemed to lean not toward him but away, as if the very air mistrusted the hand that now claimed to speak for it. Harry did not step back. He stepped down, one stare then another, and spoke again, now not to the crowd, but to the man before him, and he told him of the piece of soul that had lived in him like a parasite, a shard lodged by accident, the night the curse first rebounded, a shard that had tied their lives together and taught snakes to speak in a human mouth, and made scars burn when evil drew near. And he told Voldemort that it was gone now, burned away by the curse in the forest when the Master had unknowingly cut the last thread that bound the boy to him. And this was why death had not taken Harry with it, because the blow had struck the parasite and not the host. And the boy who had walked into the trees had come back alone for the first time since infancy, himself and only himself. Voldemort listened and called it lies. He called it childish hope decorated with big words. And yet his eyes flicked to the snake in the cage beside him, to Nagini, who had served as his last safe harbor, and those who could read such glances understood that even as he denied, he counted his anchors and felt the list grow thin, and the defenders felt this too, an almost physical loosening in the chest, a sense that the impossible had become merely difficult, and difficult was something they had faced all night without giving way. The crowd pressed closer to the edges of the courtyard. The walls of the great hall thrummed as if the stones themselves leaned in to see how this would end. And Harry drew a breath and said the last thing that needed saying, that the Elder Wand would not kill its true master, that it would not deliver the final blow against a wizard to whom its allegiance had passed, and that if Voldemort tried to end this with a single curse, he would only provide proof that even legends obey laws older than fear. And the words landed like pebbles into a pool that suddenly revealed its depth, because people who had never held a wand in battle still understood the logic of loyalty and the betrayal that comes from forcing what will not be forced. This was the point where many expected compromise or retreat, or at least a new plan. But Voldemort had never learned those movements. He had only ever learned to advance, to press, to bend or to break. And so he did the only thing he trusted. He raised the Elder Wand and shaped the syllables that had ended more lives than anyone could count. While across the stones the boy lifted his own wand, a wand he had not stolen from a tomb, but one that had chosen him long ago, and then another that had been won in the heat of flight, not through grave robbery but through contest, and the air between them drew tight as a wire ready to sing. Around them the last fighters found their places, friends grasped hands and released them. Portraits paused in their frames with brushes halfway to canvas. House elves clutched ladles like swords. Centaurs on the slope notched arrows and then held. Dementors circled and were held back by a silver ring that did not falter. And in the high windows the sky began to thin from pure black to the blue that means morning is considering entering the day. And under that thinning light, two figures faced one another, one who had made himself less than human to avoid being mortal, and one who had chosen to walk into death and return without it inside him. Harry spoke a final sentence to the man who had haunted his life, not a taunt but a truth, telling him that remorse is the only magic he has never studied, the only one that could mend what he tore, and that without it, he has nothing left but a broken one's promise, and a crowd that waits to see whether power is a fire that burns out when it has nothing more to feed on. And Voldemort answered, not with words but with the motion of a hand and the sound of a curse that had defined an era. Two lights leapt, one green and one red gold, and the courtyard fell into a silence so complete it felt like a physical thing. A dome dropped over the whole of Hogwarts, and beneath it, everything that had led here came together. The prophecy half heard and half fulfilled, the choices made in orphanages and classrooms and graveyards, the loyalties of wood and core, the decisions of boys on towers and thieves at wands' tips, and the eyes of a world that had been held hostage by fear, waiting to see if fear at last would The spells met in the space between them and the air folded inward, a pressure like storm at sea, the light binding and twisting, the Elder Wand straining in a hand that was not its own, the other wand answering with a clarity that did not need to prove anything, because it already belonged where it moved. And then the balance shifted in a way that everyone could feel even if no one could name it. A change as simple as breath, drawn and let go, as inevitable as a tide turning. What happened next would decide not just who lived, but what story the world would tell when it spoke of this night, and for a heartbeat that stretched into forever the castle, the forest, the lake, the sky. Every wand and window and stone waited with it, poised on the edge between a reign of silence and the return of voices. The courtyard had been stretched into eternity by the meeting of two lights, one green and one red gold, and when at last the force of destiny resolved itself, the Elder Wand spun from Voldemort's grip as if it had made a decision of its own, arcing through the air to land far from him, while his own curse rebounded with a sound like stone cracking in winter, and the green light that had defined his life turned inward, striking the man who had shaped an era with fear. And the silence that followed was deeper than the silence before, because this one carried finality, the kind that comes when even arrogance can no longer argue with reality. For a moment, no one moved. The Death Eaters frozen as if their masks had become part of their faces, the defenders staring as if afraid to believe what they had seen, and Harry stood, with his wand lowered not in triumph but in exhaustion, his chest heaving, his arm trembling, the truth of what had happened settling slowly across the courtyard, until at last a sound broke it, not a shout of victory, but a gasp of disbelief, and then another, until the truth became undeniable. Voldemort was gone, the body that had called itself immortal lying still, the face pale and empty, the red eyes closed at last. The Death Eaters faltered first, some dropping their wands and stumbling backward, some fleeing into the night without waiting for orders that would never come, and others simply standing lost, as if their entire lives had been suspended from a single thread that had now been cut, and the defenders, weary and bloodied, began to step forward, slowly at first, as if afraid of a trick, and then faster, gathering around the boy who had stood against the storm and somehow remained standing when it broke itself upon him. Hogwarts itself seemed to exhale, the walls that had groaned under assault now settling, the fires burning lower, the wards no longer screaming as they strained, and in that release the survivors found their voices again, calling names, finding one another, lifting the wounded, mourning the lost, because victory never comes without a price, and the list of the dead was long, carved in memory even before stone would carry it. But for now, grief walked hand in hand with relief, because the shadow that had stretched over their lives had been burned away in a single flash of light. Harry moved among them, not with the stride of a conqueror, but with the steps of someone who had carried too much and survived only by refusing to fall. And people touched his shoulder, his sleeve, as if to remind themselves that he was real, that he was alive, and each touch passed like a spark, not of celebration but of recognition, that the boy they had trusted had done what no one else could, and that the burden had finally been lifted from all their backs. Voldemort's body was left where it fell, not honored, not hidden, because in the end, it was just a body, stripped of the terror that had clung to it for decades. And this was the final defeat. Not only that he was dead, but that he was ordinary in death, no more terrible than any man, and this truth spread faster than any decree or proclamation, because to see him still was to understand that fear had given him more power than he had ever truly held, and now even that fear was gone. The hours that followed blurred into work, clearing rubble, carrying the wounded to makeshift beds in the Great Hall, comforting the children who had seen more than they should ever have been asked to see, and planning the funerals that would follow with the dawn, because mourning could not wait, not when so many names pressed against hearts already raw, and through it all, the castle hummed, as if aware that it had stood one more time, as if proud of the people who had defended it, even as it grieved for the ones it had lost. When the sun finally rose, it touched the stones with a light that felt different, not brighter, but cleaner, as if the night had left behind a residue that daylight burned away, and the ground smelled of smoke and soil, of fire quenched and earth torn open. And in that morning the first funerals began, names spoken, bodies lowered, friends and families standing together in silence, broken only by sobs and the occasional laugh that escaped when someone remembered a kindness or a foolish act from the one they mourned, because grief always walks beside memory and cannot help but brush against joy. Voldemort was gone, the war was ended, and yet the work of rebuilding stretched endlessly ahead, roofs to mend, walls to raise, lives to piece back together. And though no one knew exactly how to begin, they did. One stone lifted, one bed carried, one child comforted, and in those small acts, the future began. Not because anyone commanded it, but because life itself insists on moving forward, even when hearts feel too heavy to follow. And so the story closed, not with the thunder of spells or the roar of giants, but with the quiet of people helping one another in the shadow of broken towers. And in that quiet, the meaning of victory revealed itself, not in the fall of a dark lord, but in the rise of a community that had chosen to endure, to heal, and to carry its dead with love instead of fear. And as the morning stretched into day, Hogwarts stood again, scarred but unbroken, a witness to the truth that even the darkest night ends when the sun returns.